So welcome back. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the application of the trans-theoretical model to physical activity and exercise behaviors in African American adolescents. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the background of how the theory of the trans-theoretical model, has been applied to studies with children and adolescents in terms of examining its influence on physical activity. Okay, so there is some research lacking support for the relationship between the trans-theoretical model constructs and physical activity in children. And so one study found that the stages of change, and notice that I'm using the little acronym SOC for stages of change. So the stages of change were not significantly associated with 8 different measures of physical activity in elementary school children. Right? So why would, to me, this brought the question in mind as like, why would someone be motivated to just engage in push-ups or to engage in sit-ups? It just seems like a bizarre way to study the influence of the stages of change to these type of behaviors. I thought it was strange. There's some other studies found that the stages of change did not help predict moderate to vigorous physical activity in 7th graders. Sorry, I think I went too far. Okay. However, there is some research demonstrating support for the relationship of the trans-theoretical constructs to leisure time physical activity in children. So leisure time physical activity in one study by Lee was greater in adolescents that were in the advanced stages of change compared to adolescents who were in the early stages of change. So children or adolescents who were in like the pre-contemplative or contemplative stages of change engaged in less leisure time physical activity than those, for example, in the action or maintenance phase. So that seems very commonsensical. And what we would expect to find. Flemish adolescents in another study by Debordeux-Douy. Flemish adolescents varied in their pros and cons of physical activity across the different stages of change. So that, if they were in the early stages of change, they might have lower pros and more cons for physical activity than in the later stages like action or maintenance stages. Self-efficacy was also greater in later stages of change, such as during the action or maintenance stages. They also discovered that there were gender differences, so that more girls tended to fall in the earlier stages of change for physical activity compared to boys. Oh, there's a typo here. So more girls were in early stages of change, and were inactive compared to boys. Okay, so that their early stage of change was accurately paired with a level of inactivity. Okay, what about changes in physical activity across the lifespan? So we know from the research that there is a dramatic drop in physical activity during adolescence. So if you have children, elementary school age children that are already inactive, they are likely to be inactive adolescents. If you have in childhood, kids tend to be naturally more physically active. But as they transition into adolescence, even though they were active as children, sometimes they tend to transition toward inactivity. this is particularly true for girls. So we see the greatest drops in physical activity in African American youth. Okay, so if this is a natural process of dropping in physical activity as we move toward adolescence, from childhood to the adolescent, this effect is even greater in African Americans. What else did I want to tell you about that physical activity? So it's greater, this drop is greater in African Americans. We also know that this drop is greater in girls than it is in boys. Okay, so girls are more likely to drop as they transition into adolescence. Most trans-theoretical model interventions are aimed at individuals in the action phase. And what do you think that is? And see, many of you already alluded to this in your questions, like why should we bother with someone in the pre-contemplation or the contemplation stage? Well, I mean, it's logical, right? It's harder to motivate someone who's in this pre-contemplative or contemplative stage. It's easier to target those people that are already motivated toward behavior change, who are already in the preparation or early stages of engaging in physical activity. And so people come in to try to work with them to make sure they maintain physical activity, right? It's easier to work with someone who already wants to do the behavior, who already has the mindset of wanting to engage in the behavior. So no research, according to the authors, had examined the 4 trans-theoretical model constructs in relationship to physical activity in African American youth. So they couldn't find a study that measured the stages of change, decisional balance, processes of change, and self-efficacy all in one study with African American youth. Okay, so that was their goal. So the purpose of the study, it had multiple purposes. So first they wanted to examine what was the interrelationship between all the different trans-theoretical model constructs. How are they related to each other? And so they proposed 2 hypotheses along this line. They said that the pros, self-efficacy, and the processes of change indicated here through POC would increase with each stage of change, right? So that seems like a logical hypothesis to make, right? This is what we expect to happen. People in the early stages, such as the pre-contemplatives, are going to have probably assess fewer pros to changing their behavior. They're going to have lower self-efficacy to engage in the behavior, and they're going to be less engaged in the processes of change to engage the behavior compared to those in later stages of change. So that seems like a very logical guess or hypothesis as to what they would expect to happen, right? Hypothesis 2, they proposed that the cons of engaging in physical activity would decrease with each stage of change. So that you might see a lot of cons in that pre-contemplative stage, but decreasing as the person or the individual, as the adolescents move toward the advanced stages of change, like action and maintenance. Okay, a second major purpose was that they wanted, and probably the main purpose, they wanted to examine the utility. So the second one, the second bullet, they wanted to examine the utility of the trans-theoretical model to predict moderate to vigorous physical activity and total physical activity. Okay, so they wanted to see, it's really important to engage kids in moderate to vigorous physical activity, but any kind of physical activity is better than no physical activity. So they wanted to look at both of those things. And the manner in which the trans-theoretical model and its related constructs predicted these types of physical activity. So the first hypothesis stated that the stages of change, pros, self-efficacy, and the processes of change would predict more minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity and total physical activity, right? So advanced stages of change would predict more physical activity. The more pros one has, the more for physical activity, the more likely they are to engage in more minutes of physical activity. The greater the self-efficacy or confidence to engage in activity, the more likely they are to engage in that activity. And the more engagement or use of the processes of change to motivate themselves to engage in the behavior, the more likely they are to engage in physical activity, right? So this makes sense, right? At least to me it does. Hypothesis 2, the cons, right, would predict fewer. So if the adolescents had lots of cons for physical activity, that would predict that they would engage in fewer minutes of physical activity, whether it be moderate to vigorous or total physical activity. And then finally, they wanted to look at gender differences in the relationships between the trans-theoretical models, constructs, and physical activity. So their first hypothesis was that African American girls would classify themselves in lower stages of change, so in that pre-contemplative or contemplated stage, compared to African American boys who would likely classify themselves in more advanced stages, like in preparation or action or maintenance. Hypothesis 2 was that African American girls will have fewer pros and processes of change, lower self-esteem for engaging in physical activity, and greater cons for physical activity compared to boys. So that was all their hypotheses. So let's see what they found. Okay. Oh, well, let's see what they did first. So they recruited children and adolescents in Washtenaw County, Michigan, which I hear is very beautiful. And these children, they were children and adolescents from middle school to high school, and then also from all sorts of after-school programs and community resource centers, or recreation centers, I'm sorry. So they recruited these kids to participate in this study called the Health and Culture Project, which was a nutrition and physical activity education program that examined associations between social, cultural, and psychological factors to physical activity, diet, and obesity risk in African American adolescents. Okay. So in the end, they were able to recruit 273 youth who were between the ages of 11 and 18 years of age. However, they were only able to retain a subset of 109 African American adolescents who completed, had all the data completed, including the surveys measuring all those constructs we talked about for the trans-theoretical model, and who also had completed objective measures of behavior through the accelerometers, which they would take home and use at home throughout the week, I think. The measures included measuring the stages of change, right, which is a main focus point in the trans-theoretical model, using a two-step question. They measured the processes of change with 15 items. They measured self-efficacy with 6 items, self-efficacy for physical activity. They measured pros and cons of physical activity with 10 items, 5 for the pros, 5 for the cons. And then they had this objective measure of physical activity. So physical activity was not self-reported in this study. Rather, it was measured through accelerometers. Okay. And then, of course, they collected demographics, age, sorry, I can't remember. Age and grade level, I think, and they measured their weight and their BMI, and I can't remember what the other demographic was. Okay, so let's look at their results for what did they find. And so in examining the interrelationships between the trans-theoretical model constructs, so how were the constructs related to each other among this group of African American adolescents? And so hypothesis 1, if you will recall, said that the pros, self-efficacy, and processes of change for physical activity would all increase with each more advanced stage of the stages of change or readiness to change. So what they did find in support of this first hypothesis was that self-efficacy was significantly higher. Self-efficacy for physical activity was significantly higher in children who were in those later stages of change. So maintenance, right? So children in the maintenance stage had higher self-efficacy for physical activity than those in the pre-contemplation and contemplation stages. What they didn't find, so everything in red is things that did not support their hypothesis. They found that there was no significant differences in processes of change or PROs across the different stages of change where they found the children to be in. Okay, hypothesis 2, the cons would decrease with each stage of change. And they didn't find that relationship. There was no significant differences in the cons for physical activity across the different stages of change. Okay, so a little bit of support regarding self-efficacy, but not the other constructs of the trans-theoretical model. These did not advance with the stages of change as predicted. Okay, so let's look at the second setup of the second purpose. So they wanted to look at the utility of the trans-theoretical model constructs to predict moderate to vigorous physical activity. And so they also wanted to look at its ability to predict total physical activity. But let's just look at the findings for a moderate to vigorous physical activity. And so their hypothesis was that the stages of change, the PROs, the self-efficacy, and processes of change for physical activity would predict more minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So that if somebody was in more advanced stage of change, that person would likely have more minutes of activity than those who were in the pre-contemplation or contemplation stage. The person who had more PROs, could list more PROs for physical activity, was also likely to engage in more physical activity minutes. The person who had greater self-efficacy or confidence to engage in physical activity is more likely to engage in more minutes of physical activity, as well as the person who engages more processes of change for physical activity. Okay, so that was, again, practical, logical hypothesis, right? The best guess as to what they expected to find in this study. What did they actually find? Again, we see a mixture of black and red outcomes, with the red outcomes not confirming the hypothesis. Okay, so advanced stages of change predicted more minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So yay, right? So kids that were in maintenance engaged in more physical activity than kids in those early stages. And adolescents in the preparatory, okay, so depending where they were, right, the later the stage, or the earlier the stage, the less likely or the fewer minutes they engaged in moderate to physical activity. So when analyzed by gender, when analyzed by gender, these effects listed above, this pattern was found only for girls but not for boys. Okay, so these things, the stages of change, did not predict differently for boys. It only predicted for the girls. And perhaps they suggest that social and environmental factors are stronger predictors of physical activity in African American boys than the stages of change. Okay, so other things are influencing whether they engage in physical activity. What did they find that did not support? So the moderate to vigorous physical activity was not significantly associated with processes of change for the pros, or self-efficacy for physical activity. Okay, so these other things did not help predict moderate to vigorous physical activity in African American adolescents. So we see some evidence only for the stages of change, no predictive ability to self-efficacy measures, pros of physical activity, or processes of change to engage in physical activity. Okay, their second hypothesis was that cons would predict fewer minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So the more cons an adolescent had, the less likely they would engage in physical activity, right? And they did not find any association. So moderate to vigorous physical activity was not at all associated with the number of cons. Okay. It didn't matter how many cons there were. There was no association there, at least no significant one. So utility, finally, their third thing that they were trying to examine was these same things that we were looking for up here, but in regard to total physical activity. So what they found was no significant relationship between any of the trans-theoretical constructs and total physical activity, right? So not stages of change, not processes of change or self-efficacy or pros and cons of physical activity predicted how much total physical activity the adolescents engaged in, okay? So they attributed these to differences in definitions of total physical activity in the different studies. So previous studies would have found these effects. This study did not. They suggest that the definitions used in previous studies were actually definitions of moderate to vigorous physical activity, so that it didn't compare to the way they were defining total physical activity in this particular study. And also differences in measurement of physical activity behavior, so that accelerometry was used in this study, but previous studies used self-report of how frequently they engaged in physical activity. Okay, so those type of differences can lead to contradictions in findings, just because things are not being done exactly the same way. And so that's it for this lecture. It's short and sweet. For the next lecture, I think I'm going to post just a PowerPoint presentation, but I will not post a recorded lecture for that one. So I think tomorrow morning I'll try to put up the exam review both for this study, for this section of your readings, and also for last week's, which I know I still owe you those. And so don't worry, I will put them up hopefully in the next day or two. Okay? All right. Well, you have a good day.